The United States Navy built the fastest fighter it had ever owned. Then it banned that fighter from landing on its own aircraft carriers. For nearly 2 years, the plane sat exiled from the ships it was designed to defend, handed off instead to land bases in the jungle, while pilots gave it a nickname that had nothing to do with the enemy. They called it the Ensign Eliminator. The engineers had chased one obsession above all else: speed. They built the smallest possible airframe around the largest engine they could find and the largest propeller ever bolted to a fighter plane. It worked. Nothing in the sky could catch it, but the same design that made it the fastest thing in the Pacific also made it nearly impossible to see over on final approach, and pilots were dying because of it before they ever fired a shot in anger. The Navy's own weapon had turned against the men flying it. Its name was the Vought F4U Corsair. The story begins in 1938, in a design office at Vaught's plant in Connecticut, with an engineer named Rex Beisel. Beisel had spent the better part of 2 decades building airplanes for the Navy, trainers, scout bombers, dive bombers, quietly earning a reputation as one of the most capable aircraft designers in the country. That year, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request that read less like a specification and more like a dare: build the fastest carrier-based fighter that had ever flown. Beisel took the challenge literally. His approach was almost brutally simple. Instead of designing an airframe and then finding an engine to fit it, he worked backward. He chose the single most powerful engine available anywhere in American aviation, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster rated at 2,000 horsepower, and then built the smallest, tightest airframe he could wrap around it. To turn that horsepower into speed, he paired it with the largest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft, over 13 feet across, nearly as tall as a man standing on another man's shoulders. It was a philosophy stripped down to a single sentence: speed was king. Every other consideration, comfort, visibility, ease of landing, would bend to that one priority. But a propeller that large created an immediate, unglamorous engineering problem. To keep those blades from chewing into the deck of a carrier, the landing gear needed to be long. Long landing gear meant a wider, heavier, more complicated undercarriage. Exactly the kind of weight and drag Beisel's team was trying to eliminate everywhere else on the airframe. The solution came out of a meeting between Beisel and his aerodynamicist, a young engineer named Alfred Sabila, as the team argued over where to mount the wing. According to Sabila's own account, it was Beisel who asked the question that changed the shape of the airplane. Why not bend the wing itself, right at the point where the landing gear attached, so the strut could be shorter without sacrificing propeller clearance? That single question produced the Corsair's most recognizable feature, the inverted gull wing, bent downward from the fuselage before angling back up toward the wingtips. It looked strange. It looked, to some observers, almost wrong. But it solved the propeller problem elegantly, and it did something else too. Mounted low and perpendicular to the fuselage, the bent wing cut aerodynamic drag in a way a straight, high-mounted wing never could. Fabricating that curved wing center section turned out to be one of the hardest manufacturing challenges Vaught's shop floor had ever faced, but the shape held. When the prototype was finished in early 1940, it carried the largest engine, the largest propeller, and arguably the largest wing ever built for a naval fighter to that point. The principle behind all of it could be summed up in 3 words, and Beisel's team never wavered from them: speed is king. Every compromise the airplane would eventually be forced to make, every visibility problem, every violent landing, every young pilot who never made it back to the carrier, could be traced back to that single, uncompromising decision made in a design room in 1938. Nobody in that room yet understood how expensive that decision was going to be. In June of 1938, the Navy signed a contract with Vought for a single prototype, given the designation XF4U1. The requirement behind it was almost brutally direct: outrun everything else in the sky, launch from a carrier deck, and win. Nobody at the Bureau of Aeronautics needed to spell out why. Half a world away, Japan already possessed a fighter that Western pilots had not yet fully reckoned with: the Mitsubishi A6M0, a nimble, long-ranged interceptor that would, within a few short years, embarrass every Allied aircraft sent against it in the opening months of the Pacific War. The Navy did not yet know the Zero's name, but it knew, in the vague and urgent way that military bureaucracies sometimes know things, that whatever was coming would need to be fast enough to matter. Vaught's prototype took shape through 1939, and by February of that year, the mock-up had passed inspection. Construction moved quickly after that. On May 29, 1940, at Bridgeport Municipal Airport in Connecticut, test pilot Lyman Bullard took the X-F4U-1 into the air for the first time. What happened next made headlines. In level flight, carrying a full military load, the airplane crossed 400 miles per hour, the first American fighter in history to do it. It was not a marginal record. It was a statement. The Navy had asked for the fastest carrier fighter ever built, and Vought had delivered exactly that, ahead of anyone else in the country. Formal acceptance trials began in February 1941. The Navy signed a letter of intent that March, received Vaught's full production proposal in April, and by June had awarded a contract for 584 F4U-1 fighters, inheriting the name Corsair from an old Vought Scout biplane of the 1920s. On paper, it was everything the Navy had asked for. A carrier fighter faster than anything else in production, armed and ready to meet whatever Japan could put in the air. Then came the part nobody in Connecticut had fully planned for, landing the thing on an actual ship. In the fall of 1942, a Navy test pilot named Sam Porter took a Corsair out to the escort carrier, USS Sangamon, steaming in the calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay, to run the airplane through its first real carrier qualifications. It went badly. On approach, in the nose-high attitude every carrier landing demands, Porter found that the Corsair's long engine cowling swallowed his entire forward view. He could not see the flight deck. He could barely see the landing signal officer standing at the edge of it, waving him in or waving him off. He made 4 landings. Each one felt, in his own account afterward, like it might be his last. He called off the test, convinced the airplane was going to kill him before the enemy ever got the chance. The mechanical problems compounded the visibility problem. The Corsair's landing gear oleo struts, the shock absorbers meant to cushion touchdown, were tuned too stiff. Instead of absorbing the impact of landing, they bottomed out and kicked the airplane back into the air, sending it bounding across the deck like a dropped ball, sometimes clean over the arresting wires meant to catch it. A fighter that could outfly anything Japan had built could not reliably put itself back down on the one flight deck it was designed to call home. The Navy made its decision in early 1943. Rather than delay the airplane's combat debut while engineers chased a fix, it diverted the entire first production run away from carrier duty altogether. Every Corsair coming off Vaught's line would go instead to land-based Marine Corps squadrons, flying from crushed coral airstrips carved out of jungle islands in the Solomons. The carriers themselves would rely on a different, more forgiving fighter to fill the gap, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, slower than the Corsair by a wide margin, but a genuinely easy airplane to bring home to a pitching deck. It was, by any measure, a strange kind of victory. Vought had built exactly what the Navy asked for, the fastest fighter of its era, with a production contract to prove it, and the Navy's answer was to send it away from the ships it was built to fly from. The airplane that had shattered a speed record over Connecticut in 1940 would make its combat debut 3 years later, not from the deck of a carrier, but from a dirt strip on Guadalcanal, flown by men who had not been part of its design and had no say in its flaws. Speed had won the contract. It had not yet won the war. And somewhere out over the Solomon Sea, the airplane the Corsair had been built to beat was already waiting. On February 13, 1943, Marine Fighter Squadron 124 lifted off from Guadalcanal on an escort mission to Bougainville, and the Corsair went to war for the first time. It did so 6 months before the Hellcat ever fired a shot in anger. The airplane exiled from the carriers was, in the end, the first American fighter to meet the enemy in the skies over the Solomons. The early results were rough. Marine pilots were still learning the airplane's temperament, the torque that could snap a wing down at low speed, the vicious stall that gave almost no warning before it arrived. But they were also discovering something the Navy's carrier qualification tests had never measured: what the Corsair could do once it was already in the air, moving fast, with room to work. The tactics that emerged were not subtle, and they were not meant to be. Marine pilots learned to use altitude as a bank account. Climb high, spot the enemy below, dive, fire, and keep diving through the fight rather than turning to mix it up. It was the only sensible way to fly against the airplane waiting for them in the Solomons. The Mitsubishi Zero, light, astonishingly maneuverable, and by 1943 already a legend in its own right, a fighter that had run circles around Allied pilots from Pearl Harbor to Malaya to the first desperate months over Guadalcanal itself. Turn with a Zero at low speed and a pilot was already losing. Dive on one from above, fire once, and keep the speed up. That was a fight the Corsair could win almost every time. By the middle of 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons were no longer just surviving contact with the Zero. They were dominating it. Production ramped to match the demand from the front. The airplane that had been quietly shuffled off Navy carriers less than a year earlier was, on land, becoming the most feared American fighter in the Pacific theater, and Japanese pilots were starting to notice. No squadron would come to embody that shift more completely than VMF 214. The unit was reorganized in September 1943 at Espiritu Santo, built out of a rough assembly of replacement pilots and men without a squadron to call home, misfits in the loosest sense, thrown together under a new commanding officer who was something of a misfit himself. Major Gregory Boyington was over 30 years old, a decade older than most of the men now under his command, already a combat veteran with 6 victories claimed flying P-40s for the Flying Tigers in China. His pilots would later call him Pappy, though inside the squadron itself the nickname was actually Gramps. The press would make Pappy famous. What the squadron called itself, officially and unofficially, was the Black Sheep. Flying Corsairs out of Munda and then a forward strip on Vella La Vella, VMF 214 pushed missions up the Solomon chain toward Kahili and eventually Rabaul, one of Japan's most heavily defended air bases in the entire Pacific. Boyington's approach to those missions bordered on theatrical. He would circle over the Japanese airfields at altitude, taunting the defenders over the radio, daring them to come up and fight on his terms. Altitude in hand, diving passes only, no turning fights against airplanes built to win exactly that kind of fight. In their first 2 weeks flying combat patrols, the squadron claimed 23 enemy aircraft destroyed and 11 more probable, against the loss of 5 of their own pilots. Across 2 combat tours spanning roughly 12 weeks, the Black Sheep would claim 94 Japanese aircraft destroyed, a figure that made VMF 214 the most celebrated Corsair squadron of the entire war, and Boyington its most famous pilot. Popular accounts of the Corsair's overall record against the Zero would later cite kill ratios as lopsided as 11-1. The true number, when historians went back decades later and cross-referenced every documented Corsair engagement against surviving Japanese loss records, was almost certainly less extreme than the legend that grew around it. Combat claims on both sides of any air war tend to run ahead of what actually happened on a given afternoon. But even accounting for that gap between legend and ledger, one fact was not in dispute. By late 1943, the airplanes that had been judged unfit for its own aircraft carriers was systematically beating the fighter it had been built to beat, and it was doing it with pilots who had never set foot on a flight deck at all. Victory in the Solomons did nothing to solve the problem that had gotten the Corsair banished from carriers in the first place. The same nose that gave it speed was still swallowing the view on approach. The same stiff-legged landing gear was still bottoming out and throwing airplanes back into the air on touchdown. Out on land, on long crushed coral runways with room to spare, those flaws were survivable. An inconvenience, a reason to come in, a little hot and a little careful. On the deck of a moving ship, with a few hundred feet of runway and an ocean on either side of a mistake, they were something closer to a death sentence. The nickname told the story better than any accident report could. Navy pilots had started calling it the Ensign Eliminator, and the name was not affectionate. An ensign was the Navy's newest, least experienced rank of pilot, fresh out of flight training and often flying combat-ready aircraft for the first time in his life. Those were exactly the men least equipped to compensate for an airplane that hid the deck from view at the precise moment they needed to see it most. A Corsair coming in for a carrier landing had to hold its nose up at a steep angle to keep from stalling, and at that angle, the long snout housing the massive engine blocked everything directly ahead. Pilots learned to crab the airplane in sideways, angling their whole body and line of sight out past the edge of the cowling just to catch a glimpse of the landing signal officer standing at the stern, then snap the nose straight at the last possible second before the wheels touched down. It was not a technique taught in any manual. It was a workaround born of necessity, passed from pilot to pilot, and it did not always work. When it failed, the airplane bounced, or ballooned, or dropped a wing into a stall 6 feet above the deck, and men who had survived enemy fire over the Solomons died in landing accidents on ships that were never even under attack. This was the same design principle from the very beginning of the story, arriving now to collect its debt. Speed is king had meant a nose built around the biggest engine in American aviation. That decision had won the airplane its speed record in 1940. It had won Vought its production contract, and now in 1943, that identical decision was killing the Navy's own pilots before they ever fired a shot at the enemy, not because the airplane was weak, but because it was built, deliberately and specifically, to be fast at the cost of everything else, including the one thing a carrier pilot needed most, the ability to see where he was landing. The fix, in isolation, was not especially complicated. Vought's engineers increased the air pressure in the landing gear oleo struts, which largely tamed the violent bounce on touchdown. They replaced the original heavy-framed birdcage canopy with a clearer, frameless bubble canopy and raised the pilot's seat by 8 inches, buying back a small but real slice of forward visibility. A stall strip was added to the leading edge of one wing to correct the airplane's tendency to drop one side before the other at low speed. These were not radical redesigns. They were the kind of incremental corrections any aircraft goes through once it meets the real world. And yet the Navy did not rush to put the corrected airplane back aboard its carriers. Certification dragged on, year after year, while the fleet's flight decks continued to rely almost entirely on the Hellcat, a fighter 15 miles an hour slower than the Corsair, but one that pilots could see out of, and one the Navy had already committed itself to as the safer bet for shipboard operations. Political and institutional caution had joined the technical flaw as a second obstacle, and together they kept the fastest fighter in the American arsenal grounded from the very ships it had been designed, from its first pencil sketch, to defend. Out in the Pacific, that delay was not free. The Corsair might have been dominant against the Zero in the hands of veteran Marine squadrons flying from fixed island airstrips, but the war was not staying still to wait for the Navy's paperwork. Japan's Naval Air Arm, badly bled by 1943, was straining to answer the airplane that was tearing through its formations over the Solomons and Rabaul. There was no clean new fighter waiting in the wings to solve the problem the way the Corsair had solved America's. Japan's aircraft industry was already stretched past what its resources could support, its best engines maxed out, its most experienced pilots dying faster than the training pipeline could replace them. But the Zero did not need to evolve to remain dangerous. In the hands of a skilled pilot, on the right day in the right position, it was still lethal, and every Corsair squadron flying into the slot toward Rabaul knew it. The margin the Corsair held was real. It was not infinite. And the same bureaucratic caution keeping the airplane off American carriers meant that its full weight, Navy and Marine squadrons together, land-based and ship-based, all flying the fighter that had already proven itself in combat, was still not being brought to bear against an enemy that was weakening, but not yet broken. By the final months of 1943, the Corsair occupied a strange, unresolved position. It was, by every measure that mattered in the air, the superior airplane, faster, harder hitting, better at diving away from trouble than anything the Japanese could put up against it. And it was still, in the eyes of the service that owned it, not good enough to be trusted with a carrier landing. The flaw that had exiled it to the jungle in the first place had never actually gone away. It had only been managed, patched, and postponed. While pilots kept dying in landing accidents the enemy had nothing to do with, and while a Navy that badly needed every fast fighter it could put in the sky, kept its best one waiting on the sidelines of the one battlefield, the open ocean, ship to ship, where the war in the Pacific would ultimately be decided. Something was going to have to give. It would not come from Washington, and it would not come from Vaught's design office in Connecticut. It would come, unexpectedly, from a British aircraft carrier and a landing pattern nobody in the United States Navy had thought to try. The final months of the Black Sheep's campaign in the Solomons built toward a climax. Neither the squadron nor its commanding officer saw coming, even though Boyington himself had spent weeks daring the enemy to make it happen. On December 27, 1943, over Rabaul, Boyington and his pilots tangled with a formation of zeros in one of the largest air battles the Black Sheep would fight. Boyington himself claimed 6 kills that day alone, adding to a personal tally that was climbing toward a number no Marine aviator had reached before him. He kept flying missions into the new year. On January 3, 1944, escorting a strike near Rabaul, Boyington engaged a formation of Japanese fighters and claimed his 28th confirmed victory of the war, a number that made him, in that instant, the highest-scoring Marine Corps ace in American history. It was a record that had cost him nearly 2 years, 3 theaters, and a squadron built from other men's leftovers, and he had just claimed it in the middle of a dogfight thousands of feet over enemy territory. Moments later, Boyington was shot down. His wingman, George Ashman, went down with him and was killed. Boyington survived the crash into the water, was pulled from the sea not by American rescue, but by a Japanese submarine crew, and disappeared from the war entirely. For the next 20 months, while the war in the Pacific ground on toward its final year, the man who had just become the Marine Corps' leading ace sat in a prisoner of war camp, his fate unknown to the squadron he had built, and the country that would eventually award him the Medal of Honor under the assumption that he was already dead. 5 days after Boyington disappeared, VMF 214 flew its last mission of the campaign and was disbanded. The Black Sheep as a fighting unit were finished, not defeated in the air, but run out the natural end of a brutal, brief, and spectacular combat tour, closing out with the same abruptness that had defined the squadron from the day it was scraped together out of orphaned pilots 4 months earlier. It was, in its way, the closest thing this story has to the kind of personal downfall that usually belongs to the engineer rather than the pilot. Rex Beisel, back in Connecticut, faced no such reckoning. He was not disgraced, not imprisoned, not forced to watch his creation dismantled around him. The airplane's day of reckoning belonged instead to the men who flew it into the teeth of Rabaul's defenses, to Boyington, sitting in a POW camp, not knowing whether the country he served even knew he was alive, and to George Ashman, who did not survive the same afternoon that made his commanding officer a legend. But even as the Black Sheep story ended in captivity and loss, the airplane's deeper problem, the one that had exiled it from carriers in the first place, was finally being solved, and not by the country that built it. The breakthrough came from the Royal Navy. British Fleet Air Arm squadrons had taken on Corsairs earlier that year, flying them off carriers like HMS Illustrious, and they arrived at the problem without 2 years of institutional caution weighing them down. British pilots were already used to flying the Supermarine Seafire, another long-nosed fighter with its own visibility problems on approach, and they adapted a landing pattern they had developed for that airplane. Instead of the standard American approach, downwind, then a crosswind turn, then a straight final approach that left the pilot staring at nothing but engine cowling and open ocean, British pilots flew a slow, continuous curving turn all the way from downwind to touchdown, never straightening out until the final seconds before the wheels met the deck. The curve kept the landing signal officer and the deck itself in view almost the entire way down. It did not eliminate the Corsair's long nose. It simply refused to fly the airplane in a way that let the nose become a problem. It was not a redesign. It was not a new canopy or a stiffer strut. It was a different way of flying the same airplane, developed by pilots who needed a solution and did not have the luxury of waiting for Washington to certify one. By 1944, with the stiffer oleo struts, the raised bubble canopy, and now a landing pattern proven safe by British carrier crews, the case against the Corsair had run out of ground to stand on. The Navy could no longer credibly argue that its fastest fighter was too dangerous for its own flight decks. Late that year, more than 7 years after Rex Beisel had first put pencil to paper on a 1938 speed requirement, the United States Navy finally cleared the F4U Corsair for full carrier operations. The workforce that had built it never stopped through any of it. While Boyington sat in a camp in Japan and the Navy dragged its certification process into a third year, Vought's production lines kept running, turning out airplanes for squadrons that would carry the fight from the Solomons all the way to Okinawa. The engineer who designed it went back to running a company. The pilot who made it famous went to prison. And the airplane itself, indifferent to both their fates, kept flying, faster than anything else in the Pacific, still difficult to land, finally, grudgingly, welcomed home to the decks it had been built for all along. By the time production of the F4U Corsair finally ended in 1952, Vaught's assembly lines had turned out nearly 13,000 of them, one of the longest continuous production runs of any piston engine fighter in aviation history. The airplane that had almost been strangled in its own carrier trials outlived the war it was built for by 7 years, and it did not simply survive into peacetime. It went to Korea and kept fighting, flying close air support missions over a different war entirely. Its speed advantage less relevant against jet opposition, but its ruggedness and bomb-carrying capacity as valuable as ever to the troops on the ground beneath it. The corporate lineage behind the airplane followed a quieter, more American northeastern path than the Nazi industry stories that so often dominate this genre. There was no dismantling, no forced reinvention into sewing machines or bicycles, no occupying power picking through the wreckage of a defeated factory. Chance Vought remained part of United Aircraft Corporation, the parent company it had belonged to since the 1930s, through the post-war years and the Korean War production runs that followed. The Vought name would eventually pass through decades of mergers and reorganizations common to the American aerospace industry. Spun off, folded into larger defense conglomerates, its assets and engineering legacy scattered across companies that exist today under different names entirely. But there was no single dramatic collapse to point to, no single date when the company that built the Corsair ceased to exist. It simply evolved, the way most surviving American manufacturers of that era eventually did, until the firm that built the fastest fighter of the Second World War was, decades later, a name mostly remembered by historians and aviation enthusiasts rather than a business anyone could still visit. Rex Beisel's own path closed just as quietly. He never faced a reckoning of his own, never watched his life's work seized or dismantled. He continued as general manager of Vought Aircraft through the years the Corsair was proving itself in combat, and in 1949 was named vice president of United Aircraft Corporation, the position from which he eventually retired. He died at his home in Sarasota, Florida, on January 26, 1972, at the age of 78, an old man in Florida sunshine, a long way removed from the design room in Connecticut where he had once asked a simple question about bending a wing. The airplane he built did not fade the way his company eventually did. Surviving Corsairs are today among the most sought-after warbirds in the world, restored to flying condition and maintained by private collectors, museums, and airshow circuits across the United States and beyond. The National Naval Aviation Museum, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and dozens of smaller collections around the country hold Corsairs in their galleries, some static, some still capable of taking to the air on a summer afternoon for a crowd that has no memory of the Solomons or Rabaul, but still recognizes that unmistakable bent wing the moment it appears against the sky. Airworthy examples still perform at air shows every year, their radial engines producing the same deep, uneven growl that marine pilots on Guadalcanal would have recognized instantly, coming in low over a runway that no longer has anything to do with war. The historical verdict on the airplane has settled into something more balanced than either its harshest critics or its most devoted admirers would prefer. The engineering was, by any honest measure, vindicated. Every problem the Corsair carried into its early service life, the visibility, the bounce, the violent stall, was ultimately solved, not by abandoning the airplane's core design philosophy, but by refining the execution around it, and the fighter that emerged from those fixes went on to outlast nearly every other American piston fighter of its generation in frontline service. The delay in getting it onto carriers cost time, and it likely cost lives among young pilots who might have flown a corrected version sooner if institutional caution had moved faster than it did. But the airplane itself was never the mistake. The mistake, if there was one, belonged to an aircraft industry and a peacetime testing culture that had not yet learned how quickly a good design could be pushed through fixes under the pressure of a war that would not wait. What survived in the end was not just an airplane in a museum hangar. It was a lesson the Navy would carry into every fighter program that came after. That speed bought at the total expense of everything else is not free, and that the truest test of a machine built for war is not how it performs in the calm skies over a test range, but how quickly its flaws can be found, understood, and corrected, once real pilots and real combat go to work on it. The F4U Corsair paid that lesson forward in landing accidents and lost ensigns before it ever collected on its promise. By the time the war ended, it had more than made good on the debt. There were, in the end, two ways to build a fighter for the Pacific War, and neither one was wrong. One philosophy said, take everything away. Strip the weight, strip the armor, strip anything that does not directly serve the turn and the climb until what remains is light enough to dance in the air with an opponent twice its size. That philosophy built the Zero, and for 2 brutal years, from Pearl Harbor through the first desperate months of the Solomons, it was very nearly unbeatable. The other philosophy said the opposite. Add everything. Take the biggest engine in American aviation and wrap the smallest possible airframe around it. Take the largest propeller ever built for a fighter and bend the wing itself to make room for it. Chase speed past every reasonable limit and worry about the consequences later. That philosophy built the Corsair, and it very nearly cost the Navy the airplane before the airplane ever got the chance to prove itself. Subtraction against addition. Lightness against power. A fighter that turned like nothing else in the sky against a fighter that could simply refuse to turn at all, climb away, choose the moment, and dive back down with everything that extra weight and that oversized engine had bought it. By 1944, addition had won, not because it was the cleverer philosophy and not because the men who built it were smarter than the men who built the Zero. Mitsubishi's engineers had solved their own version of an impossible problem with real brilliance. Addition won because it could still be corrected. A Zero pared down to its absolute minimum had almost nowhere left to grow. There was no more weight left to save, no more performance hiding in a design already stretched to its limit. A Corsair built with power and speed held in reserve could take a stiffer landing gear, a taller seat, a clearer canopy, a smarter approach pattern, and simply become a better version of the same idea. One philosophy had already spent everything it had by the time the fight began. The other still had room to grow into itself. The Navy that once refused to let its fastest fighter anywhere near a carrier deck spent the rest of the war building its air power around exactly that airplane. The pilots who once called it the Ensign Eliminator flew it to Okinawa, to Korea, into the record books as one of the longest-serving fighters America ever built. And the enemy fighter it was designed to beat, the one that had once ruled the Pacific sky by right of pure maneuver, became instead the measure against which every one of the Corsair's kills was counted. Somewhere over the Solomon Sea, a fighter almost too fast to land finally learned how, and it turned out that was enough.